Hi, this is Issa Nakazawa, your host for Transmission Studio, a show featuring the independent artists and community-based organizations that make San Francisco's arts and culture scene what it is today. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Connie Zheng in the studio. She is a Chinese-born artist, writer, and experimental filmmaker based here in Oakland, California. So stay tuned. Hi, Connie. Thank you so much for coming onto the Transmission Studio and joining us today.
Hi, Issa. Good to be here.
Yeah, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit like how you self-identify your work and a little bit about the questions and curiosities that inform it?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I would self-identify as a multidisciplinary artist. I make large-scale drawings, mostly maps, but also like other kinds of drawings. I make experimental films. I call them participatory scenarios because I don't really like the term social practice, but I guess you could say they're often projects that invite participation from a public or a community. And I also do installation and sound work.
Amazing. Yeah, so I heard about you through the Chinese Cultural Center. Shout out YY. And I am curious, like, how that came to be. Like, how was that? How did you find out? I mean, you probably heard about them already, but, like, how did you get involved with 41 Ross? And, how did you hear about it? And what was the connection for you there?
Yeah, so I learned about CCC, actually, when Hui, the current deputy director, reached out to me a couple of years ago when she was a curator there. And and she reached out kind of out of the blue and was like, hey, I'm with the CCC, would love to do a studio visit or, just a meeting. And I think she had, learned about my work through a mutual friend of ours. And and that was maybe in 2018, 2019, I can't remember, but it was a while ago. And so we've been in touch since. And in maybe like 2021, she mentioned that CCC would be piloting an artist in residence program through 41 Ross, and then suggested I put in a proposal, and I did, and then I guess I was part of the inaugural season of 41 Ross artists.
I love that. I admire when curators have that kind of Rolodex of artists they want to work with, and so there's like that kismet of like, okay, now's the time for us to work together.
For sure.
And then so tell us a little bit about this table. I know it's called Table to Farm, right? Like what was the proposal, and tell us a little bit, give us a glimpse into what that was like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I knew really what it was when I wrote the proposal. Like the actual project manifested very, very differently from how, what I wrote in the proposal. So I don't really remember what I did in the proposal. But I think the project really it started to come into existence when I was thinking about just like different like thematics that I was interested in working with through the residency. And at that point, I'd been doing a lot of work related to seeds. And so I'm sure my original proposal had something involving seeds. And when Hui and YY took me on a tour of Chinatown shortly before the residency started, I was thinking about how I wanted to shift my practice like through this opportunity. And how could I be responsive to the interests of the people who live and work in Chinatown and really make it this incredibly vibrant place. And of course, food is like what everyone thinks of when they come to Chinatown. And obviously there's a very rich food culture there, lots of really interesting food history too. And so I guess like the idea kind of came about when I was like just spending time walking through like the market stalls, for example, the grocers, and just thinking about how like fresh seasonal eating is actually a foundational aspect of cooking in most of the world. Yeah. It is like seasonal farm to table eating is not specific to like Berkeley, you know, like that. And like we, you know, I think especially in the US, associate the farm to table movement with Berkeley, with this very like upper middle class, like bourgeois culture that is largely white.
Yes.
And I was, yeah, and then I was thinking about like, well, how can we flip that? How can we really like flip the script around that and really center Chinatown as part of that conversation around like fresh, healthy eating, especially since, you know, a lot of Chinese restaurants are known for very unhealthy food.
Yeah.
They're no, you know, it's like they're associated with like deep fried food, but most Chinese families I know, including mine, don't eat like that at home.
Absolutely.
It's like we don't eat like General Gao's chicken at home. We, you know, we eat like steamed like bok choy.
I really resonate with this inversion of table to farm. So can you tell me a little bit? I totally resonate with the proposal has nothing to do with like, yeah, what was that process like? And in terms of thinking about how you involve the community and shaping it, like, is it through observation or is it through active participation? Like, what did that process look like?
Yeah, well, like there's sort of like different phases, you know, to each like process. And so I think for Table to Farm specifically, it started out with just like a tour that YY and Hoi took me on of Chinatown. And I learned a lot, but it was also very, and it was just very, it was a pretty like open-ended tour. It's kind of like, what are you interested in general? And I was thinking about ways that this incredible opportunity and space could change the way that I've worked. And, you know, I really wanted to like humble myself in that way, you know, to just like, how can I allow myself to be transformed by this experience? And and so, you know, at that point I've been doing a lot of work around seeds. And I was thinking, could it be a seed related project? I don't know. And as we were walking around, it just became very apparent how much fresh food, like fresh, like produce was like a major defining feature, both like in terms of like from like an olfactory perspective, but also just like visual and, you know, and like the whole movement. You know, there's so much movement that happens in relation to food. Like in the mornings, you know, there's like legions of aunties and grandmas like getting their produce.
And then me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, at like 7, 8 in the morning. And so the patterns, you know, the patterns of movement in Chinatown are really, I feel like, shaped a lot by people accessing food. You know, there's people getting produce at certain hours, but there's also tourists going to restaurants. There's also people going to work, you know, in these restaurants. And so like you have these different like waves of movement that I feel, that I felt like were very much driven by sort of like different groups and classes, you know, and like of people like feeding themselves.
That's so powerful.
And that's like, you know, and as an Asian person, I grew up with like food shaping my entire routine. You know, it was like everything is around food. And plus I really wanted to make sure that the project you know, that whatever I did while I was there was both like conceptually interesting enough for me to really like dig into, but that would be accessible to folks who may not, you know, be super versed in like art discourse. Like that is really, really important to me. I didn't grow up in a family of artists. My parents are still very confused about what I do. and I think it was important for me that like someone like my grandma could come to this show and the programs that I put on while I was there and understand what was going on. So like the whole sort of frame, the whole container for my show at 41 Ross and also all the programming was focused on tracing food, like farm to table pathways. And from with all these different points of entry. So, with like experimental film screenings, but also with a community mapping project and a mooncake collaboration project where we worked with some SRO residents in Chinatown to make custom mooncake designs, or to design custom mooncake molds.
Wow.
Yeah, which we then gave to some bakeries. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, and so we worked with some bakeries to produce custom mooncakes.
I think thank you for sharing all of the different like levels, and I had written that in one of the questions that I loved. The descriptions of your work that I'd read was around that dual commitment of like conceptually rich work, but work that also speaks to conditions and to real people. And I think there's something really rigorous about that, like how do we make sure that our work is also not fractured along these lines that I think are kind of illusory. Like there's an assumption, I think, that something that speaks to people's somehow dumbed down.
Totally.
Right. And I think, we've all probably gone through our own internalization of certain modes of knowledge and production. And I think that the way that you said you wanted to humble yourself is cool. Like when you use an opportunity as a moment to push and stretch yourself. So I love all the different levels and scales. And I like this idea of movement and also cycles of seasons, cycles of like the actual ritual of food throughout the day. And I read that you lived in Chinatown for 5 years, or the edge of it.
Yeah, so it was very much on the edge.
I know what you meant. San Francisco is so small, but like I feel like I'm like when you're on the edge of Chinatown, you're somehow also kissing the mission, or it's so funny. But like, how was it being like literally inhabiting Chinatown again? And like, were there any big observations or changes that you'd seen since your time there?
Yeah, that, I was thinking about that question on Bart here, and shout out to Bart. And I was like kind of shook when I realized that it wasn't like, I feel like the most, like it was actually like very profound to be there again, not necessarily because I'd noticed a huge change in Chinatown, but because I felt like I was a very different person. Oh, wow. Yeah, so it was this really interesting, like, I don't know if homecoming is the right word, because I was never really part of the Chinatown community, in that way.
I know what you mean, though.
And it was like, oh, actually, like, I have changed so much since the time that I lived there. Like I used to walk through Chinatown every single day on my way to work, and at that point, I had no connection really to Asian American history. I didn't know anything about Asian American organizing. I didn't know anything about like Chinese exclusion, about, like how Chinatown has been this safe haven really for Chinese immigrants and migrants since the 1800s. Like I just had no idea. I was very alienated from that political history. And it was really, it was actually like a life-changing, transformative experience to do that residency in Chinatown, because it was like the first time where I was spending almost every day, like in Chinatown itself, like just saying hi to neighbors, like, and actually being like, feeling myself, like invited into and part of this community that I had just always passed through, like it was like, here are people who look like me, but I'm just passing through.
Yeah.
And it was like, no, actually I'm here and I'm borrowing a ladder from the business owner across the street. I'm here and the same grandma is walking by every day.
Shout out to the grandma.
Yeah, shout out to the grandmas. And, the same, like I see the same people walking by every day, like the same, and just starting to get to know people and say hello in that way was really magical. And it was probably the first time, like that project was really, I think, the first time I ever felt like really understood what it felt like to have a project supported by a community. Like it actually made me like cry. Like the first time I like realized that it like this, like the mooncake collaboration project, like that was it actually like did take basically a village, and like that project was insane. It was just like, I can't even tell you how many strangers I like told about that project and who were like, let me know how I can help.
Wow, yeah, that's really profound to me. Like when our art practice or creative practice can be this site of transformation from alienation to connection. I think a lot of the myth of the artist, capital A, is like around this kind of loner archetype.
Usually a dude. Usually a cis white dude.
Right. And we can internalize that, you know, and kind of, I think it's subconscious often or unconscious that we think that like living the life of an artist or this kind of mythology of the artist is something that is worth striving for. But I also think, I wonder if some of that alienation is really important for your art making, and like the fact that you can, I don't know, I find that experience important too, because sometimes the distance allows us to see in a different way than if we always start from a place of belonging. It's a little subjective because I feel very like outsider-y, but I think that passing through and having that ebb and flow between insider outsider is really generative. And I do think there's sometimes not a burden, I think that's not my place to say, but I think there's sometimes a responsibility when you feel always a deep belonging, that your art and that what you create has to reflect the like multitude of everyone's truth. And so sometimes the outsiderness affords you a little bit of space and grace to like take up space in your own story. Whereas if it's like, I've born and raised in Japantown, I think I can imagine that would create some claustrophobia creatively for me.
For sure.
I'm like, grandma, like auntie, you know, I'm like trying so hard that maybe my voice is so stifled in the voice of the community. And I am curious if there was any tug of war there, like in terms of like, even if not this project in general, if you've ever had that tug of war in your work around like letting community not speak through you, but like really taking the lead and like being kind of just like, I'm going to use these resources and liberate them and distribute them, versus like, I actually really want to say something specific about these movements and about food.
Yeah, that's a great and very complex question. And
Scorpio to Scorpio.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I'm so glad we established that before the interview started.
Right.
Oh my gosh. You know, I feel like I barely even know how to how to begin to answer that, because there's because I mean, I completely agree with you. I think I think only like recently I like realized that a lot of like one of the major questions or like concerns threading through a lot of my practice, like almost all of my projects, is thinking about how to really develop creative strategies for like defamiliarizing.
That's a hard one.
It is a hard one. There's a lot of syllables.
Standing up. That's a tricky one.
For defamiliarizing like spaces that feel really familiar to us. And I think that definitely came from me like being born in China and then growing up in the States, but going back to China like almost every summer, and having this sort of like whiplash experience of constantly like feeling like a stranger somewhere and needing to rebuild like my narrative of a place, and always having to incorporate new information. And so like, I mean, the Bay is where I've never lived in one place as long as I have in the Bay. And so like the Bay very much feels like home to me. My family lives out here now.
Oh wow.
And like I definitely really resonate with this question of, you know, like feeling responsibility to a place. I mean, especially when you're doing work in community, you know, especially like community that is quite economically disenfranchised. That's just something that I always am very sensitive to. And I think that's one of the reasons I probably haven't made a documentary film yet. Like I think it's like there's so many very like nuanced ethical questions, you know, that come with different kinds of storytelling in place. And so, yeah, like I have, yeah, and I feel like I'm not really answering your question.
No, you are. I mean, it was more just like like thinking collaboratively. And I think that's why I asked a question about archival, because I think, I love archival. And I think obviously probably for both of us, the answer is always like both or it's contextual. But I also really like work like the Mooncake collaborations that are more about the collaborators and that present moment. And you can archive it and document it, but it is really... it's hard to recreate. Yeah. And so it seemed like your work involves like both, but I was curious about like how what your relationship is to archiving, or if you have a preference for like the presence work.
Yeah. Great question. I feel like this is also like a question appreciation session, but I mean, as you know, I mean, there's sort of like a really boring answer to that.
I love boring.
So I can start with the boring answer, which is, as an artist working with institutions and trying to get funding.
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah, like the archive is like everything. Like the archive is how you get grant money. The archive is how you get support a lot of the time. And so, yeah, I actually do keep pretty meticulous, and I don't know if they're well organized, but I like extensive archives of a lot of my projects. They're not all archived online, because I feel like the writing around projects is really important, and so it does take me a really long time to update my website. Like the Mooncake project is still not on my website, even though it's been over a year, and because like that project was huge, and there are probably hundreds of like video clips related to that project. Yeah. And I do really respect like the ephemerality of just of a project where, you know, it happens and maybe there's a trace that you can share afterward, but it's, you know, if it's like, well, you know, like while working on the project, it didn't feel right to take photos of everyone. And so that we just don't have that. That's okay with me. I think, I mean, I think a lot of like archiving is also about like consent. And
that's a good, I love that answer, because I do think it's helpful to let people know who are watching the importance of having a strategy in a sense behind like archiving and documenting to make sure, because I do have friends who don't archive and they don't get the grants, right? So I think that's not boring, so real. And then also to your not being so obsessive or compulsive about it that you misread the moment of like you're actually losing trust now with community.
Totally.
Like, get the photo.
For sure. Yeah, because like that connection is so important. And especially, and also when you're working on like film projects, you know, that's really important. I mean, I've only ever made short films, and they tend to be pretty experimental, but like one of my first short films was this very much like participatory project where where people were the performers were invited to sort of imagine themselves as part of this world that I wanted to build with them. And so like a lot of the prompts were very much were sort of these like, were built actually off of like contact improv prompts.
Amazing.
that I worked with my assistant director to create. And it was like all the power in the footage was in how much people were getting into that world.
Absolutely.
You know? And so like I took maybe like, I didn't really take that many photos, you know, like it was all just like, what is everyone feeling right now? What is the energy in the space right now? And
that's the process part of the work too. There's like the different, like you said earlier, there's like the different processes and phases and different instincts that come into play around like which gets documented and where there needs to just be like trust building.
Totally.
This has flown by, and I have so many more questions. I'm like, we need a part 2.
I know, for sure. I was like, how was that 5 minutes?
I know.
Yeah.
But I am curious, like, how folks could stay in touch with you. I know, it sounds like you have a website, or whatever you feel comfortable with sharing.
Yeah. So I have a website. I also have an Instagram. It's listed on my website. And
what's the link?
So my website is just my name.com. So it's conniezheng.com. And my Instagram is yconniezheng. And I'm in the process of starting a newsletter. Oh, yes. But it's still just a put your email.
It's just an aspiration.
Yeah, it's definitely an aspiration. But and
And do you have, can people see Table to Farm still at 41 Ross? Is that, I saw it sunset in September. Okay. Yeah. So let's, DM Connie and let's pressure her to put this website up so we can see.
No, the website is up. The
Okay.
website is up. It's
Great.
just, it's a little out of, it's like 80% up to date.
Okay.
But
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
There's just like a few big projects missing. But I also currently have work up at, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts as part of Bay Area Now. I recently finished a map of Asian farm worker history in California. It's 9 feet long. Wow. It's up at YBCA, so check it out. And and actually as part of that, so I'm like, now I'm just like in full. I actually am also giving out free risograph prints of that map at YBCA, and you can only get them at YBCA. So
oh my gosh, I'll be going there right now. Well, Connie, it was such a pleasure speaking with you, and we'll be sure to follow you and keep up with your work. So
thanks. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into my conversation with Connie, and stay tuned for next week's episode of Transmission Studio.